Thank you, everyone. It's kind of awesome to speak in a room full of people who make a city or a state run. I'm a reformed journalist by trade. I'm used to being on the other side of the mic and taking notes and asking questions. So delivering the story is always kind of an awesome experience. I want to talk a little about who the Volcker Alliance is, put New York in national perspective in terms of our budgeting work, and also let you know that since those slides went into the book, I've modified and updated them some, and I can give you a copy later if you wish. So, without further ado, let's make this clicker work. Yes, I will. Very good. So, without further ado, let's talk about the Volcker Alliance for a second, and also thank some of the people that made my work and this presentation happen. Number one, to Carol at the CBC, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the Laura and John Arnold Foundation and the Peter G. Peterson Foundation for supporting our work. A big thank you and shout out to Dick Ravitch, who has supported this our work from the very start, and who can't be with us today as he's recovering from surgery. And also thank you to Stephanie Miner, one of our board members. Mayor Miner has been a big supporter. So thank you to you all. So what's the Volcker Alliance? Paul Volcker, the former head of the Federal Reserve Bank, set up the Volcker Alliance in 2013 with the goal of advancing the effective management of government to achieve results that matter to citizens. He elaborates on that in his new book that just came out a couple weeks ago. He's been a terrific supporter, and really he's the son of a civil servant, the city manager in Teaneck, New Jersey, and has always prided himself on efficient, effective government. He and Dick Ravitch ran the Budget Crisis Task Force, which looked at 5 states, including New York and New Jersey, just after the recession. I took this over and expanded this to a national program, and we look at states. We look at states in a kind of a different way. We give grades, but we don't give total grades out for the states. I'll talk about grades. I'll talk about how we do it and who our research network is. But first, a little bit about the history of our work. Our first report came out in 2015, was a proof of concept study looking at Virginia, New Jersey, and California. We then came out last year with a full report on all 50 states, and the new report, Truth and Integrity in State Budgeting, Preventing the Next Fiscal Crisis, came out last week and is available on our website, or if anybody would like a hard copy, let me know, and we'll mail it as soon as it's back from the printers. There's more available on our website. We have a data laboratory and a lot of other data applications there at volckeralliance.org. We do our research in a unique way. We don't have a whole room full of people poring over spreadsheets and poring over documents. What we do is we ask about 30 standard questions about state budget procedures in 5 areas that I'll detail in a second. The idea here is to look at how the states put their budgets together. 49 states are required to have balanced budgets by law. Does anybody know the one that doesn't have a law? It's Vermont. And they followed. Indiana actually didn't have a law until this year, but they had a group of laws that made it effective. But despite all these laws, nobody's ever defined a balanced budget. So it's if you know one state, you know one state. Every state does it differently. So we look at the process and we evaluate the process with a view toward transparency and sustainability. We do this with a group of schools. These are public finance professors and graduate students at CUNY here in New York, Florida International, Georgia State University, University of California, Berkeley, University of Kentucky, University of Illinois, Chicago, and Springfield, University of Utah, and our backstops are Municipal Market Analytics, who are our data consultants, and Barrett and Green, who many of you know from the pages of Governing and Forbes, who have covered state budgets for many, many years. All this gets wrapped up into a big report that comes out, as I mentioned, every fall. So what are the results? Let's look first at the fiscal framework, because that helps explain where states are today. Number one, we're in what looks like the second longest GDP expansion since 1858, when records began. We're looking now toward maybe a slowing economy next year. But the latest numbers I saw on Bloomberg suggest there's a 15% probability of recession. That's from a poll of economists. There's some variance there. There's some who see 20, some who see 50, but there's not a huge chance of a recession. But a slowdown seems likely. We're still going to have low inflation and probably low unemployment, at least for the next couple of years. All this adds up to fatter budgets for states. Now we're in a recovery that began in 2009. It's finally showing up in state budgets. NASBO, National Association of State Budget Officers, figures that fiscal 19 state budget spending will be up 3.2% over the year before, so it's maybe at inflation or maybe a little better. This is still below the historical average of about 5.5%. So states are being cautious, and that's very important, and we'll discuss that. Why are states being cautious? Number one, they're building up their rainy day funds. The 3-year average reserve trend that we've tracked is pointing up for the second straight year. State rainy day funds are going to be about 6% of general fund spending, and that's the highest share of general fund spending in at least 18 years. So states are putting money in the can against that eventuality. We also have sort of the risks. Number one, federal budget uncertainty. We're looking at a government shutdown, but that just speaks to the tensions that are going on in fiscal matters in Washington. The budget gap is over 4% of GDP nationally, and that means that Congress may make more discretionary spending cuts that could affect the states. We don't know. We have a split Congress, but it's something that's on our radar, and I'm sure yours as well. State budget pressure points besides that. Legacy costs. We look at OPEB and pensions together to come up with a legacy cost grade. The trend in improving legacy cost debt is on the way up, but 2/3 of the states are still experiencing stress in pensions or OPEB or both. 2/3 of the states get a C grade in this area on an A to D minus scale. That's not good. That means that pensions and OPEB still have to fight it out with Medicaid, infrastructure, K through 12, and debt service for resources. And when we talk about infrastructure, we have to be aware of these debts. Finally, states are not going to borrow their way out of or borrow their way into prosperity. The muni bond market is recovering slowly. New money issuance is likely to be up next year, but sales are still running in the $325 to $350 billion range. That's nowhere near what we saw during the big boom from Build America bonds, certainly. It's an issue. In some states, they'd rather put money into reserves than put money in the ground in new bridges, or at least there's a constraining factor there. So it's not a huge boom, at least as far as state budgets go. So how do we grade the states? We look at the states in 5 key areas. We arrived at these areas by doing a very lengthy literature search and polling public finance professors, polling budget directors, legislators around the country to come up with 5 areas that make up a budget. One is budget forecasting. It's kind of geeky, but it's very important because it shows you the path ahead. So it's how and even whether states estimate revenues and expenditures for the coming fiscal year and the next few years beyond. Budget maneuvers. Some people would call these budget gimmicks, but here it's the dependence on one-time revenues or one-time actions to offset recurring expenditures, something that New York gets fairly low grades for, with all due respect to Mr. Megna here. Legacy costs. I mentioned that before. It's how it's how well, with all due respect to the governor too, how well state how well states fund the promises they've made to public employees for pensions and retiree health care costs. Reserve funds, which is the conditions of general fund reserves and rainy day funds, and rules governing their use and replenishment. And the rules are sometimes as important as the balances. And then finally, budget transparency. Every state has a budget website. Some do it really well. Some do it really awfully. But there are some key areas within that transparency category that we watch. One is tax expenditures, how well the states disclose them. Some states do it really well. 8 states don't do it at all. And also the estimated cost of deferred infrastructure maintenance. Steve mentioned infrastructure as a key item. This is an area we've only found 3 states that come up with a number in the budget for the cost of deferred infrastructure maintenance, and that's just awful, and it's something that needs to change, and something we're doing some further research on. So the 5 state budget principles, these just flow from the grades. States should use a consensus approach to establish single binding estimates for revenues and expenditures, certainly revenues. This is an issue in Jersey right now. Budget maneuvers, states should pay for expenditures. One should pay for expenditures with recurring revenue earned in the same year. Legacy costs, states should consistently make the contributions that actuaries recommend or determine for pension and retiree health care plans. I realize that almost everywhere in the United States, OPEB is a pay-as-you-go basis, but GASB also insists that it be done on an actuarial basis. So as long as the rules say you do it that way, we think you should adhere to them. Reserve funds, I mentioned. Clear policies for putting money in and taking money out of reserves are really important. California is a state that does that quite well. And then budget transparency, which we just covered. So let's turn to the grades. As I mentioned, we don't do an overall grade on the states like some other organizations do. The reason is that there's, number one, Mr. Volcker doesn't like that, and number two, there aren't any failed states. Even states with the most challenging fiscal situations, Illinois, New Jersey, Kansas, Connecticut. States like this have practices that are worth emulating. So to call them a failed state is not entirely accurate. So we go from A to D minus. If you want to roll the grades up, you can, but we don't go there. So what are the 3 states that get the most A's? That we can determine. They're California, Utah, and Idaho. California, we gave A's for budget maneuvers because they're running a very clean budget, which is really remarkable, seeing as 10 years ago California couldn't pass a budget and was selling IOUs to pay the bills. So they've had an economic recovery and also a procedural recovery in their budget. Another state with a governor and now a supermajority of Democrats in both legislatures. California also gets high grades for transparency and reserve funds, but at the same time they get a D or a D minus for their legacy costs, their legacy cost treatments. They have huge unfunded liabilities, and in the most recent year of our 3-year survey, fiscal 16, 17, and 18, they didn't make their actuarial contributions. Utah and Idaho, they're not only neighbors but rivals. They get A grades in budget maneuvers, clean budgets, legacy costs, and transparency. It's interesting that Utah will probably increase its forecasting grade. They just passed a really interesting bill, partly at our behest and partly that the Pew worked on, to improve the way they forecast. They're now doing 3-year budgets. They're doing budget stress testing as mandated by the legislature. So they really want to have a clear picture of where they're going. Some states do, some states don't. So let's look at the changes in the grades. Who are the winners and the losers in the latest tally? We'll go over that quickly. South Dakota and Texas did better in budget forecasting. In Texas, that was because they went to a consensus, a multi-year revenue projection. In Texas, revenues are projected and certified by the state controller. It's an unusual process, but Texas is now looking out in the future. In legacy costs, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Virginia did marginally better. Arizona, California, and New Mexico declined. these are mostly have to do with making the ARC and not making the ARC. It's a 3-year average grade we're citing here. In budget maneuvers, Vermont, Virginia, and West Virginia have improved. Hawaii, Pennsylvania, and South Dakota have gotten worse, and it's largely due to revenue and cost shifting, either pushing revenues forward from a future year or pushing expenditures out to another year. They're kind of technical, but that's how we do the grades. In reserve funds, New York, by the way, does very well in reserve funds, and I will get to that in a second. Montana, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Wyoming did better. Montana actually just passed a rainy day fund law. They're a state with very volatile revenue, much like New York and California and New Jersey. But in Montana's case, it's not because of it's not because of a very high marginal income tax rate or changes in personal income. It all has to do with severance tax revenues. They realize that and have passed a rainy day fund with rules that try to cope with this revenue volatility. Illinois and Pennsylvania declined in reserves. Illinois is kind of an interesting case of a state with nothing in the rainy day fund, but also they keep a lot of cash all over the budget and then do fund transfers. So they have an informal reserve policy that seems to work, along with not paying currently almost $7 billion in past due bills, which many states can't do by law. Transparency, the improvements were in Alabama, Hawaii, and Tennessee. Alabama added a tax expenditure tables, which New York has already. Hawaii did the same, and Tennessee, we gave them credit for their infrastructure deferred maintenance disclosure. We didn't in the past because it wasn't done as part of the budget, but there's a commission that's been doing it for 40 years, and we decided that's good enough, and it advises the governor. Nationally, I'll just show you some pretty pictures and zip through these quickly. These are the budget forecasting grades. Dark green is an A. Red is a D minus. You see New York. New York meets all of our criteria in this area. Connecticut is an example of a state with big fiscal challenges, but they at least do a very credible job in forecasting where they're going for the long term. Maryland has big pension challenges, also has a AAA rating, and in their budget you'll see tables that show the structural gap in the budget going out, I think, 5 years. It's very instructive because it tells everybody who's part of the budget negotiations, here's the gap we have to fill, not just today, but next year. Turning to budget maneuvers, New York, I mentioned, is one of the lower ranking states, but you see in general, states run a clean budget, which is very good. Pennsylvania being the notable exception, Pennsylvania being one of the most challenged states in the country. In legacy costs, pensions, and OPEB, how we look at legacy costs is, number one, we ask, did the state make its pension ARC or ADC, the actuarial determined contribution, and then we adjust that for the level of pension funding or the level of pension underfunding, if you will, using data that were provided to us by Bloomberg. And then we add the question: does the state make its OPEB ARC or not? We're not valuing the level of reserves because most states have very nominal reserves for this. But you see that the degree of orange and red in there shows you that those 2/3 of the states in this country have stress in pensions, and it's something to pay really close attention to, because these are debts. These are debts that are being built up now on the balance sheet, but debts nonetheless, and they're debts that in some case are long standing. Why did we give Texas a D minus? Texas is a AAA state. By all rights, it's got money all over the place, in the permanent fund, in the rainy day fund, in the UT endowment. The Texas legislature chooses not to make its actuarial contribution for pensions. They have their own number. We say, all right, that's fine. That means you're building up a debt. The debt compounds at around 7% a year, which is considerably more than the rate on muni bonds. So you're building up a debt. It's on the balance sheet. It's something to pay attention to. It may not be a problem now, but it may be a problem down the road. So we're fairly unforgiving in that area. Reserve funds. This really reflects the state of the economy and the economic recovery. There's a lot of green there for very good reason. Illinois being the notable exception. Illinois in a way, has a minus reserve because their safety valve is just not paying vendor bills. It's pretty pernicious. They every now and then they sell a bond, they roll this over. Meanwhile, they're paying 9 to 12% annually on their unpaid balances. The unpaid bills trade. The state is sanctioned a market in this. It's really quite an interesting how to do, but it's not a way to run a state. Transparency, we mentioned that generally states do a pretty good job informing the citizens on what's going on. Arkansas is one exception that it's extremely difficult, even for our experts, to figure out what's going on with the Arkansas budget. It's just a lot of numbers. It's the way they do it, but we would certainly like to see them improve in this area. So let's drill down into New York State very briefly, and if somebody wants to tell me how I'm doing on time or show up a 5-minute warning whenever it's time, just let me know. Drilling down into New York State. Okay, we gave New York State top grades in budget forecasting because New York State does consensus revenue forecasts, multi-year expenditure forecasts, multi-year revenue forecasts, and revenue growth projections. All these are really important in getting the full flavor of where the state is going. New York in general is kind of a B-ish state, and that's there's a bell curve, and you'd see most states are double A. In AA plus or AA minus in terms of credit ratings. Most states are B-ish in our rankings. In budget maneuvers, we think that there's much improvement needed here because by our tally, New York has done revenue and cost shifting. There was a period covered by this where New York was making part of its pension contribution with an IOU, interest-bearing to be sure, but not a cash contribution. Funding recurring expenditures with debt, not borrowing for debt, but not borrowing, but using debt-like techniques. So it's an area that could use improvement relative to other states. New York has an exemplary pension funding strategy. We all know about that. However, OPEB remains a huge concern. New York was not making its actuarial OPEB contribution. It has a $78 billion liability, according to the Comptroller's office. It's a big number that needs to be attended to one way or another, especially if we want to spend more on infrastructure. New York has a pretty solid reserve strategy. Some people have said that one reason why that is so is that New York doesn't spend some of the money it's appropriated. Be that as it may, financial reserves are very important. And I'll just illustrate that with one little story. They call it a rainy day fund for a reason. When hurricane hit North Carolina this fall, North Carolina has a $2 billion reserve. It was able to take $700 million and change out of the reserve to pay for immediate hurricane damage repairs until federal funding comes in. North Carolina has been pretty good about replenishing its reserves, which were highly depleted not that long ago. So this is something that we like. The rating agencies like it too. It's a question of how it's done. And then finally, in transparency, New York's got a pretty good disclosure policy. Tax expenditures are laid out. It's interesting in terms of New York's tax expenditure disclosure. They differ somewhat with the new disclosures that are mandated under GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. Some of the numbers in the New York tax expenditure report date back to 2015 and 16. But they're fairly complete. And what this comprises, why we think this is very important, what this comprises is not just the Amazon.com type economic development grants and real estate development grants, but also the big broad areas like personal deductions, which are changing with the federal code, sales tax deduction, sales tax exemptions for food and clothing. So there's a lot of broad exemptions, which states don't do a very good job of on evaluating. They'll offer them up, and they'll never ask, or rarely ask, why are we doing this? Are these policies achieving the goal that they're intended to? If the goal of sales tax exemptions for food and clothing are to help poorer residents, why is everybody getting them? Should this be done through tax credits? This is an area that we're also we've just begun a study on with a professor at Florida International nationally. So what are the 5 takeaways? And then let's wrap up. 5 takeaways. Well, before I get to the 5 takeaways, I just wanted to, I borrowed a chart from Gabe Pettick at Standard & Poor's. I see Robin Prunty is here somewhere in the audience, so with thanks to her. And this is one reason why we look at state budget sustainability. In that circle lies New York. That oval lies New York. This is a compilation of what the total spending for debt service, Medicaid, OPEB, and pensions adds up to, compared to the general fund budget. You see Illinois is up there around 50%. That's not sustainable. New York's in the middle of that oval. All of this says that should we have another recession, states with either high fixed costs like this or high sensitivity to personal income may be in trouble. Not saying that New York or New Jersey or Illinois will be in trouble, but these are the red flags. It's certainly the red flags that we watch. And the Government Accountability Office just last week came out with a new report basically saying that out as far as you can see, Medicaid is the big elephant in the room that's going to just absorb every other resource that the states have. So this is something we have to watch because Medicaid is part of that calculation too. So the 5 takeaways: budget forecasting, states need to improve how they estimate revenues, especially long-term. Budget maneuvers, the grades really reflect the economic recovery, but we could use cleaner budgeting in many areas to be more sustainable. And legacy costs, we've dealt with that. Pay the bill if you can. Reserve funds, it shows how important these are as a buffer against future downturns. And in figuring out your reserve fund balances, states need to do a better job of figuring out revenue volatility because a one-size-fits-all number just doesn't work anymore. And transparency, the 2 areas where we really want to see change and we want to work in that area are tax expenditure transparency and deferred infrastructure maintenance cost transparency. States could do a much better job in both areas. And with that, I'm wrapping up. If you have any questions, thank you to you all.